Welcome to the northeast of England. If you're joining me for the first time, hi, I'm Caroline. I'm spending a week adventuring around the area of the UK that I grew up in, and so far I've hiked by waterfalls in the North Pennines, learned about our Roman history at Vindolanda Fort and Museum, been wowed by the stunning Anneck Gardens and its spectacular second-hand bookshop in an old railway station. And in the last episode, I explored the National Trust's Cragside, taking in the interior of its house, its colossal grounds, and taking a drive along its carriageway. Today, we'll be heading a little south into Tyne and Wear to visit South Shields. Today we've come along to South Shields in the northeast of England, and behind me we've got Souter Lighthouse. It's owned by the National Trust and we're going to be going in for a tour in about 20 or so minutes. After we've done the tour around the lighthouse, we'll have a little bit of a wander up the coastal path, going via the Marsden Grotto. We might also pop in for a coffee because I've heard that the interior is supposed to be wonderful. And then we're going to be going even further up still, pretty much to where the River Tyne is, as there is an old Roman fort up there. So there's lots of little things that we're going to be exploring today. In the 20 or so minutes that we're waiting to start the tour from the lighthouse, we've decided just to take a short walk down to the coastal path, and we've come across this. We have no idea what it is. It doesn't quite look like an earthworm because it doesn't have, I suppose, like the rivets and the circles around it. We don't think it's a slug either because it doesn't have the like little antennas, and we can definitely see a mouth. The tail at the back end seems really flat, and I'm quite fascinated by it. It's stopped wriggling, but it has been wriggling. It seems to have left like a little bit of a trail the way in which a slug would. If anyone is watching this and you know what creature this is, please do let me know in the comments section below, because I'm a little bit grossed out by it, a little bit fascinated by it, and I'd just love to know what it is. Souter Lighthouse was the world's first electric one. Built in 1871, though light bulbs didn't become mainstream until the 1880s. The build cost would equate to approximately £3.5 million in today's money, but perhaps more surprisingly, only half of that was spent on the building and the living quarters for the lighthouse keepers. The other half was spent on the machinery, allowing it to operate as intended. Despite it being the world's first electric lighthouse, it had to run off of oil when the First World War broke out, as coal that would have been used to create the electricity was needed for the war effort. Souter Lighthouse now runs off the national grid, but should there be a failure, there's still the backup. The spiral staircase, typical of lighthouses, took us up to sweeping views across the coastline and to the impressive light that weighs 4.5 tonnes, or about the weight of a baby elephant. Because it's sat on Mercury, it's possible to move it with just a finger. We've just finished up wandering around the lighthouse. Part of it was guided, and then towards the end we were given a little bit of time just to have a wander around and take in a lot of the exhibits. It is a chilly day today. It's quite thick cloud. I don't think the sun's going to burn through it, and because obviously we're out on the coast, it's windy, and then add in the fact that there's no shelter because it's all just coming straight in off of the sea. So we decided to hop back in the car so we can eat our lunch in a little bit of warmth, and I've just packed up a little bit of a salad. We had salad last night for tea and didn't eat it all, so there's a chopped up sweet potato burger in there along with some cheese, tomatoes, yellow pepper, lettuce. Relatively healthy, but hopefully this will just warm us up a little bit before we start off on a wander along the coastal path. reached Marsden Grotto, and whilst the tide's out, we figured now would be a good opportunity to have a wander along what is quite a really wide and expansive beach out to this cliff, but it's got lots of caves underneath it. I was aware that around this area there used to be quite an impressive sea arch, but it collapsed a few years ago, so I thought that there wouldn't have been anything as impressive as what I'm stood under at the moment. There's people who are trying to go rock pooling. I've seen kids with buckets and fishing nets. No one seems to have had any luck, but there are things like shellfish. I think there's mussels, and I can't quite remember what all of the other ones are. Pretty sure there's loads and loads of barnacles. It's just a case of trying to watch my step. I'm regretting slightly having put on trainers rather than hiking boots with better grip. I grew up so close to here, and I obviously knew that there was a coastline and I knew that there was beaches, but I guess I just didn't realise how rugged and impressive this beach is. We've come across some people who actually had a little bit more success with the rock pooling, and a little kid got out a crab from his bucket to show it off in his hands, which was very cool. There's just seaweed strewn everywhere, and when I'm not paying too much attention as to where I'm walking, I can just hear it popping underneath my feet. The waves are crazy today. It is quite a windy, blustery day. It's definitely much colder than it has been for the last couple of days. The roaring of the noise and the size of the waves. I'm really blown away by this beach, and I almost feel a little bit sad that I just didn't realise that it was on my doorstep growing up. It's starting to get really chilly on the beach, so we've decided to come into the Marsden Grotto, which is kind of like a restaurant come pub come cafe. We've just got hot chocolate and a cup of coffee to help us warm up. The really nice thing about the Marsden Grotto is that it's actually built into the cliffside of the sea cliffs, and if you look back in history to the late 1700s, there was a guy who lived relatively locally in Allendale who was sick to his back teeth of having to pay rent to a landlord, so he decided to move to a cave here on the beach. That way he didn't have to pay any rent. He used dynamite from a local source provider to blow some further holes into the cave, making his home larger, and people got really curious by this unusual dwelling and would come here, and he and his wife would then charge them for refreshments, thus starting to make a business. Obviously we're several centuries on now, and it's passed through the hands of many different owners, some of which have also gone on to blast further holes into the rock to make the space even larger, including things in history such as a ballroom. The place is said to be haunted, and again, back in history there was a smuggler who had been accused of ratting out other smugglers to HM Customs, and he was hung from a barrel inside of here. Previous owners of the Marsden Grotto used to leave out a drink for the ghost every single night. A few years ago, a local radio DJ had supposedly drank from that, and since the local DJ did that, there were reports that there were terrible ghostings and poltergeist activities, such as ashtrays being thrown against the cave walls. Since it's dropped into the new ownership, that drink is no longer left out, and as far as I'm aware, there's not really been any more haunting activities, so I don't know if it was perhaps just a ploy that the radio station had done to drum up a really good story, but regardless, the interior of this place is absolutely stunning. They've done it out really nicely with very beautiful chandeliers and other lights, as well as twinkling fairy lights hanging from the ceiling, and it's just really quite an unusual place to come in, warm up and have a little bit of caffeine. To access the beach, we came down these steps, but because we then had some coffees and hot chocolates in the cafe, we were then able to go up in the lift. My dad had warned me and said that the lift was incredibly slow and that it's probably just as quick to come up the steps, but we decided to wait for the lift anyway, and I think one of the reasons why it's quite slow is because there's a really nice history all on the side of the lift, a lot of which I'd already spoken about whilst we were drinking our coffees. These steps, the council ended up shutting them because one of the steps was broken, and unfortunately, even though the council who are responsible for these, the fire and rescue team came along and said that because there was no safe way to evacuate if there was a fire that broke out, because the lift wouldn't be able to be used and the stairs were shut, they ended up closing down the business. And obviously the business was then very much waiting for the council to reopen it. And my understanding was that it was September 1997 when the council closed these steps, and it wasn't until the March of 1998 did it finally get reopened, and therefore the business could start making money again. It's crazy. Beautiful walk back, but again very cold, very blustery. We ended up taking a slight detour through the wildlife garden at Souter Lighthouse, but unfortunately we think it's gone into a bit of disarray, probably because a lot of volunteers weren't able to volunteer doing the gardening during lockdown. At most we saw just some snails and some leaves, even though they've got things like bug hotels and bird boxes and so on. The next place that we want to go to is the South Shields Fort, but that is right up at the very other end of South Shields, and I think that perhaps had it been a nicer day and maybe had we had a slightly earlier start this morning, we could have done it as a really big circular hike along the coastal path. But given how chilly it is today and the fact that we had a bit of a lie-in this morning, we're nipping back into the car now. We're going to drive up to that fort. Hopefully it's open, because I haven't really researched today very well. We've arrived at Arbeia in South Shields, which is a Roman fort originally built to protect the mouth of the River Tyne so that maritime links with southern England and continental Europe could be protected. It's predicted that it was built around 160 AD and was home to 480 foot soldiers and a further 120 cavalrymen. Into the 200 ADs, the fort then became almost like a supply base for all of the other forts along Hadrian's wall, and its job continued doing that until the collapse of the empire in the 5th century. At the back of the site is the latrine. One would assume that back in the Roman times there would have been big stone slabs across the top here with holes in them, probably also a bit of wood as well, so that people could sit down and do their business. But it was done communally, you know, you would sit side by side your fellow Roman men, and the poop and the pee would drop down into these crevices here. But I had wondered if maybe slaves were expected to sort of swill it all out with buckets, but apparently there was some kind of running water along here. So I guess this area must have had a running stream that did that for the Romans. This here is the commanding officer's bedroom, and apparently there would have been underfloor heating in here, which just seems crazy. We're talking here about the 4th century and there being underfloor heating. But the other thing that I find to be a little bit peculiar is that apparently the commanding officer would invite into his bedroom some of his closest friends and people that he was wanting to do business with, and business meetings and business agreements would take place in his bedroom, which just seems really odd. The painting on the wall is designed to try and replicate marble, which apparently back in that 4th century was very fashionable. Most impressed with this site, considering that it's completely free to access. I had just had the preconceptions that it was going to be an open site that anyone could walk onto, and there'd just be the, I suppose, stone ruins in the ground. I had no idea that not only is there a museum upon your arrival, but they've also got a couple of reconstructed buildings too. There's plenty of information boards around, and in comparison to Vinderland that we went to a few days ago, that's out just south of Hadrian's wall, I would say that this one's a lot more family friendly and kid friendly. There's a lot of interactive things where you can smell things that were typical smells during the times that this area was inhabited. have no idea. Oh, gross. Pee. And there's also a lot of information boards that are very kid friendly as well, where it's full of cartoon characters, the fonts in Comic Sans, you know, to try and make it a bit fun. And I have to put up my hands and confess and say, even though I'm a fully grown adult, I really appreciated how simple and easy to understand those child's information boards were. One thing to take away from this site though is I find it so weird how you've just got houses literally around the perimeter of it. Many of them have got views out onto this site, and then just as we're about to leave, a huge DFDS Seaways ferry, the one that goes from North Shields across to the Netherlands, it's just gone sailing past with this bit of backdrop to this place. I'm really impressed with it. It's completely free, so if you're in this area, I'd say come along. Even if you're just here for half an hour to an hour, it's definitely worth checking out.